Chairman Craddock, you mentioned in your statement that much of the criticism directed towards fracking is unfounded and inaccurate. And I pointed out in my opening statement that the administration is now 0 for 3 in their very public accusations that somehow fracking contaminates water. What is the harm caused by this kind of misinformation, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I appreciate the question, there's a lot of harm caused by misinformation, and I think part of the job as a regulator is to make sure that people understand we are out there inspecting and doing our job, and that we have rules, very vibrant rules in place. But when you look at, if you've got a fracking ban like we've had proposed in Texas, and we always want to make sure we are respectful of the voters, but I think misinformation in the city of Denton is part of what has caused the fracking ban vote there. It's a taking of private property rights first and foremost. So that's a real challenge. I think all of us respect private property rights and citizens to be able to develop their own mineral interests first and foremost. But it's also an economic problem for Texas. So just to give you a little perspective of where Texas is last year, and these are numbers at the end of last year, the oil and gas industry put into the Texas economy $15.7 billion into the Texas economy. That's both property tax, all kinds of taxes, but also payments to those royalty and mineral interest owners. The industry created both direct and indirect 2.2 million jobs in the state of Texas. And if we decide to ban fracking and or limit what we're going to do, then I think that you'll see those jobs go away and not come back.
Thank you for that response. And Dr. Siegel, you mentioned the two studies, 2011, 2012, that were cited by New York to justify their banning of fracking. Your own study refuted their findings. And you mentioned several times the bias involved in those studies and in the coverage of those studies. What accounts for the bias? What drives the bias? What's the motive, and what can be done about that? Turn on your mic there. Okay.
That's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. You know, I can't read into the minds of the researchers, you know, at Duke of why they designed the study the way they did. But as I said in my testimony, it struck me when I first saw the paper, the first one in 2011, that the sampling appeared to be done in a way to highlight places where a few fugitive gas well problems had occurred in Pennsylvania. You know, some have occurred, a few handful have occurred, and Dimick being one of them. And so it struck me if their goal was to come up with an assessment of, in general, systematically or systemically, is there a problem with gas wells and gas and domestic water, they should have sampled differently. As why in New York it got such impact, I think it had to do with the media coverage and actually Rob Jackson's promotion of his paper, and so people picked up on that. And how to prevent that, I really don't know. It's a big issue of how science is perceived in the public, and how to present the best science there is in a way that the public can understand it.
Mr. Siegel and Mr. Lomax. Mr. Lomax, you've discovered, no surprise, this network of foundations and activists who seem to engage in what we might call, and what you've called, advocacy science, which I don't think is science at all. You might take a swing at how do we counter this bias that you have discovered, why it is not scientific, and what we can do about it.
So I've mentioned in my testimony that I live in Colorado. I live in Denver, which is a major, you know. It's good to see you, Congressman Perlman. I have the great privilege of working alongside and interacting with on a daily basis the men and women of the oil and gas industry in Colorado who make the oil and gas industry run, geologists, engineers, other technical experts, because the oil and gas business is fundamentally a scientific enterprise. Without the science of geology, You don't know where to get the oil and gas. Without the science of engineering, you don't know how to build a well to bring that oil and gas, to the surface, so we can turn it into the energy and consumer goods that support our way of life. And if there's one thing that I could convey from my discussions with them is they just want a debate that's based on facts.
Yeah.
They just want a debate that's based on facts because as practitioners of science themselves, they know that the facts conclude that the oil and gas industry, while not being perfect, is most certainly safe. And so I think that in terms of the undisclosed conflicts and bias that you see sometimes in the research and in some media platforms that claim to be news outlets, that should be more clearly disclosed. I'm here at the committee today, very clearly an advocate of the oil and gas industry. That's not something I shy away from. It's something I'm very proud of. And I chose to go to work in oil and gas after a long and happy career as a reporter, as a journalist. So people know where I'm coming from. People can judge for themselves if I'm somebody worth listening to or not. And one of the things that I think you may have noticed about my testimony is that I was pointing people to things that pointing people to authoritative sources from outside the industry, particularly environmental regulators, so that you don't have to take my word for it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lomax. The ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all the witnesses for being here, and simply say that I am really seeking information, and I'm reading an article here now that was published in the Wall Street Journal this week, as a matter of fact, yesterday. And it talked about the Oklahoma Geological Survey released a statement on Tuesday saying it is now considered very likely that most of the hundreds of earthquakes in the state center in recent years were triggered by the injection of produced water in disposal wells. Southern Methodist University scientists, being a small university in Dallas, Texas, indicated that 2013 northwest of Fort Worth was also likely caused by the wastewater injection. Now, I don't see anything wrong with the findings. What concerns me is the denial of the findings. It would seem to me that if these findings continue, even with the University of Texas research, are we addressing the findings? That is my major concern. Just last weekend, there was a major incident just northwest, I think, of Fort Worth, near Arlington, where a family's house collapsed. And the water everyone was told not to drink the water. I've never found anything wrong with research. But my feeling is that once we find findings, rather than denying it's happening, can we start to address the issue? And what do we get from denying citizens from being so fearful that they don't want to see that near their homes? I'd like to see Mr. Lomax and Mr. Siegel, would you address that for me? What is the, I'm trying to get to why we're trying to deny this is going on. I just want the information so we can not just focus on it's not happening, to focusing on what can we do about it.
Well, I mean, I'm not denying, I never would deny that the injection of water in injection wells at extremely high rates wouldn't potentially cause earthquakes. I mean, I've seen the studies the USGS has done, and And there are a number, not many, but a few, high-capacity injection wells in which produced waters are being injected in Ohio's another place, and so forth. You know, the remedy to that is to inject probably at much smaller rates. You have more wells injecting at lower volumes. So, you know, I certainly wouldn't deny those results. They come from very credible sources. In terms of allaying the public's fears, I'm not sure how to do that. But in the context of what you just said, I mean, I think it's fairly well known now that if you inject too much fluid at a given location in certain geologic settings, you could induce some earthquakes. Now, having said that, from my reading of the journals and the literature being produced on the earthquakes in Oklahoma and elsewhere, most of them are of the kind you can't feel, but there are some that you can feel.
I have felt them. I felt
right.
them week before last.
Right. So you can't deny that, right? And I would never deny that. But the solution to that, although this is not my area of great expertise, but my understanding is that you have more injection wells spread out over a larger area, and then you wouldn't have that kind of problem. At least that's what the sense I get from my colleagues who study this kind of thing.
Mr. Lomax, you have a comment?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your question. My issue is almost never with the actual research, but the way that those findings get politicized and misrepresented and used by groups to say that hydraulic fracturing, particularly, even though we're talking about a completely separate process, wastewater injection, when they use that as somehow to build a case for banning fracking. On the issue of induced seismicity, I always go back to some testimony that was presented to the United States Senate a couple of years ago by one of the nation's leading geophysicists, Stanford University geophysicist Mark Zoback, who studies this issue very closely as an advisor to the Obama administration on this issue, and didn't say it's a non-issue, just wanted to put it in perspectives. So, for instance, he said that there are more than 140,000 of these wastewater disposal wells that are used by the oil and gas industry, but also other industries too, and that the vast majority of those have been operating safely for decades. So it's the context, and it's the lack of a factual discussion of the research that I take issue with, and that I hear about all the time from geologists and engineers inside the oil and gas industry who just want the debate focused on the facts rather than it being politicized and sensationalized and in an effort to run a media campaign to ban fracking. Thank you.
Now, Ms. Craddock, you went over, I'm going over.
But you went over more than I did.
One more question.
The ranking member will, without objection, will be recognized for another minute.
Thank you. We're aware that some of these incidents happen. My concern is when people get concerned, it's real to them. Is the answer to just keep them from expressing it by keeping them from having local ordinances, or do we make some type of recommendation to move out of these urban areas where it's happening to perhaps some other area? No matter what we can sit here and say, this frightens people. I was standing in my office, which is almost downtown Dallas, and the building shook a week ago. And I said, I'm on the 6th floor. That could not be a car. And then the news came on and said it was an earthquake. We're not accustomed to earthquakes in that area. But now we are. I mean, they're happening very frequently. Irving, Denton, Fort Worth, and all in the mid-cities area. Is it stupid to say people don't want that to happen near their homes? Because to me, to say you're not going to pass an ordinance in this state to stop this, do we have a fund to pay these people when their homes get torn up and their health is affected?
Well, thank you for the question. I think with the Railroad Commission, we obviously take seismicity very, very seriously. We, last year in April, hired a seismologist, the first time ever in the history that we have ever done that, because we are, like everybody else, looking for answers. I'm not sure it's always oil and gas related when you look at Irving. However, we have been out inspecting on a regular basis. We have rules to be followed. And based on recommendations from our seismologist last August, we adjusted some rules for saltwater disposal wells and are following those rules because we think we're trying to be respectful and responsive. However, we're still looking at the science and data like everybody else, and we think our rules and our information have to be based on good science and good information. And so, but we also at the same time as a commission have been up and done town hall meetings in Irving and Azle, been responsive to Denton, and so we want to be involved with the communities so they understand what we do and that we have very stringent rules. When you mentioned Arlington last week with a potential well that had some problems, we were on scene once we got the call within an hour, and we're on scene for 24 hours straight as an agency and are continuing to follow up with that well to make sure our rules are being followed. So we take being a regulator and an inspector, and if a rule is not followed, then we have a stringent enforcement process as well. So I think part of our challenge is to communicate that information to local communities and local residences, and we are, as we speak, trying to up our communication efforts, and we do work with cities and want to continue to do that as well.
One more question, and I'm done. When people's homes collapse, and when they have that kind of incidents, what responsibility do the companies that are doing the drilling have?
It obviously, if it's proven that they have the right to file a lawsuit, we also obviously, if a well has a problem and a rule has been broken, that we also do enforcement penalties at our agency as well. So they have the ability to file a lawsuit if that's the appropriate remedy for them.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just state very emphatically that I don't know anyone on our side of the aisle that doesn't believe that states and local communities have a right to make determinations as to what will be permitted to operate within their own borders. We, in fact, pride ourselves in believing in local controls, etc. Let me, however, with that said, I'd like to ask Mr. Holstein, you mentioned hundreds of earthquakes. You know, when people talk about earthquakes, those of us in California, we know what earthquakes are, and it's a very frightening thing to hear about hundreds of earthquakes. Just what was the dollar damage done by all these earthquakes in Oklahoma?
I don't know, sir.
You don't know? No. Okay. You mentioned hundreds of earthquakes to us. That's frightening. I think that my guess is, do anyone else on the panel have any idea what the dollar damage was done? Or is this just, that's an earthquake? I mean, there's some movement there. Do we know what the dollar damage? I would ask the panel to get back to me with that information, because my guess is that it's not very much. My guess is that it's like a big truck driving by, and that shake is called an earthquake. Do you consider, Mr. Holstein, does your organization consider any seismic activity as an earthquake?
Congressman, let me emphasize that, as Chairman Craddock noted, many of the states that have in place experienced regulators are scurrying to answer some of the questions you're raising. Mm-hmm. But their first order of business, I think, as regulators of the industry, is to discover just scientifically, what is the connection between the earthquakes and any possible
how about answering
activity?
that question?
Yes.
Does your organization consider any seismic activity as an earthquake?
No.
Okay, they don't. So what is your definition of an earthquake that gives us hundreds of earthquakes in Oklahoma?
Congressman, in my testimony, the site of the references I made to the earthquakes came from the report that the Oklahoma Geological Survey has issued in the last few days.
And they
so we didn't, let me just say, we did not do any independent investigation.
Okay.
Secondly, I want to endorse your suggestion that we gather information about the costs of whatever earthquakes may have occurred.
Certainly, because
and I think the insurance industry is probably a good source for that.
Okay. Let me note that I am a former journalist as well. And I remember a story that I covered years ago when there was, we'd had an offshore oil well disaster, or it doesn't exist anymore. The water's back to its normal state in California after that, I think it was 1969. There was a big oil spill out there. And anyway, the oil companies had decided they were going to pay for major research into the danger of offshore oil wells. And I was called in as a reporter to cover one of these hearings that they were having. And you had these guys with PhDs, and they really talk about professionals that were hired on to try to give the public some answers about the actual dangers of offshore oil drilling. Well, when I got to this hearing, there was a young lady outside with a rubber duck covered with oil screaming, "Murderers, murderers," as they went by. And that young lady with the rubber duck got all the press coverage that day. She was actually put on par, and I asked her as we left, I said, "Well, are you a student here locally?" Well, she said, "No, I'm just hitchhiking through town." And I said, "Well, how did you get over here?" She says, "Well, this guy who picked me up said that he would put me up if I would hold up this rubber duck and scream murderer at these people, and I don't like these oil companies anyway." You know, we've got to get serious about these issues, environmental issues. And there's a lot of people who are holding up the rubber duck with oil dripping from it, screaming murderer. And then what we end up with is less safe energy. What we end up with, and what we ended up in California with, was, and other places where they banned now offshore oil drilling for so long, and we ended up with oil being delivered by tanker, which is probably 10 times more dangerous than anything coming from an offshore oil well. We have people who have opposed the pipeline the Keystone Pipeline, for environmental reasons, and then we end up with even more danger transporting that same oil and gas by trains. So, look, I think nobody in there who is in their right mind is going to want there to be more danger environmentally, things that are going to hurt. We all have children. We want our children to inherit a planet that's cleaner. But what we have is people who are acting irrationally, and I believe it's all based on some Messianic theory that we've got to eliminate oil and gas because we're changing the climate of the planet. Thus, anything we do is justified. And I think we need to be very careful with our facts, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today for this important discussion. I wanted to take just a minute to recognize Camille, who is here with Girls, Inc. as my daughter for the day. She's from Oregon, and she's in the 4th grade, and she has a class in science and a class in technology at her school. So when we talk about science literacy, I want to tell you there's hope for the next generation. So back home in Oregon, my constituents reside along or near an active fault, the Cascadia subduction zone. So for this reason, Oregonians are very concerned about seismic issues, and as they should be. Currently, I know the Oregon legislature is studying hydraulic fracturing. We have none in our state at present. And as Mr. Holstein testified, both in his oral testimony and his written testimony, he was talking about the Oklahoma Geological Survey. I would like to, has this already been entered, the Geological Survey? I would like to ask that this be made part of the record today, Mr.
With that objection, so ordered.
The statement dated April 21st, 2015, where they're talking about how the seismicity rate has increased, and that it is, and I'm just going to read this so I get it right, very likely that the majority of recent earthquakes, particularly those in central and north central Oklahoma, are triggered by the injection of produced water in disposal wells. So I know that the water being injected in Oklahoma's deep wells comes from two main sources: the wastewater that originated from the water that was used to frack the wells, and produced water that comes up along with the oil and gas. So we do have that now in the record, and I hope everyone will take a look at it. Mr. Holstein, you talked about hydraulic fracturing. You mentioned heavy industrial activity, and my colleagues are talking about the right of states to properly regulate that type of activity. And I know we have a colleague here from New York. There's been a lot of conversation about what they've done in New York, and I know Vermont has also imposed a ban on hydraulic fracturing. I want to ask you, Mr. Holstein, in addition to the seismic issues which were raised with regard to Oklahoma that my constituents are especially concerned about, what other environmental concerns are associated with the disposal of fracking wastewater and produced water? And I also wanted you to just address a little bit more the use of water. You say you mentioned that in your testimony, and I know that the Texas alone has used more than 44 billion gallons of water in fracking activities. I don't have the time frame on that, but could you talk a little bit about just the amount of water? I know in parts of Oregon we're very concerned about drought. California, if we look across a lot of the country that's facing drought, can we just have a sense of the volume of water that's used?
Yes, certainly, Congresswoman. And I think you're right to put your finger on the issue that so many communities are worried about, and states, particularly those states that are suffering through terrible droughts right now, which is that these unconventional oil and gas drilling operations frequently require very large amounts of water, 1 to 5 million gallons per well. So that's dozens, if not sometimes hundreds, of trucks rumbling up and down local roads. Okay, that's one of the reasons why we argue that this is a heavy industrial activity. But the broader context in which you're putting the water issue is exactly right. It's the availability of water, it's the challenge of treating water, it's the challenge of injecting water, and the issues which you have just discussed with respect to earthquakes and, of course, protection of water supplies. And all of these issues kind of revolve around the fact that there are enormous quantities of water. How much? In my testimony, I indicate that there's approximately 800 billion gallons of water that must be managed or disposed of in the course of a year's worth of unconventional oil and gas development.
I don't want to interrupt you, Mr. Holstein, but I would like you to address in the remaining time the studies looking at the release of methane during hydraulic fracturing, please, and why that's significant.
Yes. We have done a lot of work in that area jointly with industry as well as academic partners and others in peer-reviewed studies that are taking a look at the methane issue across the entire natural gas supply chain. Excuse me. And as you know, natural gas is 97% or so methane. So emissions from anywhere in the supply chain are harmful to the climate, but they also come along with volatile organic compounds that are a hazard. To answer your question directly, the release of methane from unconventional oil and gas wells is a problem, but it's a solvable problem provided that operators use techniques that are available to them and equipment that is available to them. Because if you look at the whole supply chain of where natural gas or methane leaks from, what you find is that as much as 40% of those methane emissions will come from the production segment. We're working, as I said, with these partners to get a better handle on exactly that figure. But I think the important point that has come up through these scientifically peer-reviewed studies is that the design of the wells and the techniques used by the operators can make a huge difference in the amount of methane that escapes. And so this is a concern for local communities, as I said, because of local air pollution, and for the nation as a whole because of its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. I'd finally say that methane is a nasty climate actor. It's 84 times as powerful as carbon dioxide in the first 20 years or so after it's released. And the significance of that point, and I believe attached to my testimony and in the record you'll find a scientific article about this problem. But the significance of that is that it creates a near-term problem with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, damage to the climate. And that together with CO2 is kind of a 1-2 punch at the climate.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I have a lot of concern about fracking and seismic testing, and we get so much diverse information disseminated. You know, today we have 3 people saying positive things and 1 person saying negative things, and it's hard to tell, you know, who all's telling the truth and who might not be telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And Mr. Holstein, in your written testimony, you made things a little bit different than your oral testimony, and I think I heard you say in your oral testimony that true, there is no evidence fracking causes contamination, or maybe fracking itself. Would you repeat that for me, please?
Yes, sir, and it's hopefully I said the same thing in my oral summary as I did in the written, but if I didn't, welcome the opportunity to repeat it here. There is yet to be conclusive evidence that hydraulic fracturing itself has caused drinking water contamination. However, it is widely understood that poor well construction and maintenance can create pathways for contamination of groundwater.
That's what I want to hear. Thank you. You know, I heard people say the same thing about the Alamo. You know, it's true that the Alamo does not itself cause any contamination, but all those people that go to visit it, they probably travel there by car or something, and they probably cause some kind of pollution. Somebody else said the same thing about the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl itself doesn't cause any pollution, but people that go to see the Super Bowl, turn on television and watch the Super Bowl, that consumes energy. People said the same thing about the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty itself doesn't cause pollution, but people that take a boat to it, the boat causes pollution, taking them there, and the energy for the boat has to be produced. Somebody said the same thing about the White House. The White House itself does not cause any environmental damage, but people who go to see the White House have to travel there, and we know that virtually just about every product that we enjoy consumes some type of energy in the making of it. How do those examples differ from the point you're making?
Congressman, I think it's important for me to point out that Environmental Defense Fund has not been reflexively opposed to unconventional oil and gas development or the widespread development of these new resources that previously were economically unavailable to America. So I begin with that point and simply summarize the thrust of my testimony by saying that it is too narrow a focus simply to look at one dimension of hydraulic fracturing. That's why my testimony addresses the many issues that come along with unconventional drilling, but at the same time it points out in considerable detail the actions that have been taken in states like Texas, in states like Colorado, in states like Pennsylvania and Wyoming to try to address these concerns. And one of the things I believe Chairman Craddock has said that we so strongly support, in fact, I was thinking about it as Congressman Rohrabacher was speaking with respect to offshore drilling, and that is that one of the essential challenges for regulators is to simply keep up with the enormous amount of innovation that's going on in the oil and gas industry. And I make no complaint about that innovation. I simply note that it is a highly complex and heavy industrial activity, and regulators need to be on their toes. So let me conclude my response to you by saying that if you can imagine the many communities and states where suddenly oil and gas development is occurring, where no one alive has ever seen it before, has ever experienced it before, has ever worked in the industry before, you can imagine the challenges to elected officials at the state and local levels in trying to devise appropriate regulatory programs and oversight. And that is why we have such differences from state to state, with states like Texas having 100 years or more of aggressive and increasingly complex regulation of the industry, but other states that are just starting out. And similarly, we have a tremendous difference in the reactions that you see between the reactions you see politically to some of the local fights over banning. Very briefly.
Yeah,
yes,
I see my time is going to be up. I want to thank you. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing today. My particular interest is in offshore drilling that you mentioned, and it's through hearings like this that the chairman was kind enough to have that we share those ideas and we learn from different states and learn different techniques and do more fact-finding on these issues that maybe aren't 100% clear. Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The only member of the Science Committee from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for his questions.
I want to thank my friend from Florida because what he's brought up, you know, he's given examples, the White House and the Super Bowl and the whatevers. I think he and I both serve on the Banking Committee, the Financial Services Committee. And so one of the places where we may see an intersection at some point is with insurance, you know, property and casualty insurance, if in fact there are the dangers that some people have suggested. So we will see this come up in our other committee, I say to my friend from Florida. Now, Colorado, obviously, we've had a lot of discussion about fracking and about its place in the body politic, and legal community in the regulatory area. And so I've been dealing with this subject for 10 years now, I would say, as a policymaker. And for me, the fact that we have moved ourselves towards energy independence as a policy and as a successful goal from the innovation of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracking is good. But, and I think, Ms. Craddock, you said it well, we have to take reasonable precautions, though, with something that has helped us achieve another goal. And we've got to, as policymakers, we have to balance the dangers that potentially come from an industrial operation, as Mr. Holstein described it, and the fact that some things are going on underground, we may or may not be able to see. Some things are happening at the service where there's a collision of an industrial operation and the school next door, and whether you need a curb cut for the trucks, and what's going on in the air. Is there an escape of methane or some other emission into the air? And Mr. Lomax knows we've been having that discussion in Colorado on a pretty, heated basis. Whether it should be the local government, the state government, or the federal government in charge of all of this. Colorado, similar to Texas, it's the state government basically has the final say, our Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. And that's generally where I've been. But we cannot ignore the potential for dangers. We as policymakers have to recognize dangers, and I'm looking at Oklahoma. There was an article yesterday where the Oklahoma Geological Survey said, we're worried about seismic problems. So, you know, they said, and they attribute it to the deep wastewater injection wells. And in Colorado, we've had, you know, some seismic activity that ordinarily is not something we have in Colorado. You know, that we want that to be only in Oregon, and people come to Colorado because they're worried about Oregon, you know. Thanks. Sorry. So I would say I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Holstein. Good to see you. So take a look in what you do at EDF, what you did formerly within the administration. Am I incorrect in trying to divide it up into three sections? What goes on underground, what goes on the surface, and what goes on in the air?
Fair enough.
So what I've come to the conclusion is the surface part really is a local matter. It's zoning and curb cuts and truck traffic. Does that make sense to you?
I think my testimony strongly suggests a similar line of thinking. I hadn't divided it up quite the same way, but it makes sense, yes.
I'd ask Mr. Siegel, how do you look at how we divide sort of the regulatory components of all of this?
Well, it's hard for me to really reply to that because I'm not a regulator, okay? And I've really pretty much restricted my views to what I know and feel pretty comfortable with, which is water.
So you're a scientist and you're dealing with water and what's going on underground, right?
That's correct. And on the surface at times.
And
yes.
on the surface, okay.
Yes.
So from your experience and from your study, though, the pollution or the contamination you've seen really has been with poor casing, some poor practices with respect to the well.
Well, not quite. I mean, and my experience, which is largely restricted to the Appalachian Basin, of course, since I'm from New York, the kinds of problems that the Pennsylvania experience tells us happens are there occasional surface spills, certainly in the past, before the industry took notice, and now that amount of spillage has really decreased. And as far as the casings, you know, a few handful instances.
Well, would that be the problem in Dimmock?
Dimmock was casing issue, well, there's some question about that, whether when they drilled, there's some issues of drilling. But it could also have been casing as well. And that was natural gas from somewheres below coming into people's homes. As far as the other fluids associated with the industry, it's mostly surface issues that are the problem, and those are readily taken care of in most cases. I mean, we don't have open pits, for example, in Appalachian anymore. And in terms of the flowback water and the produced water in Appalachian Basin, it's my understanding that most of the flowback is reused to drill new wells. And so the quantity of flowback and produced water has gotten really small that you actually have to take care of, ship it to Ohio or something for deep well injection. But because the industry has developed ways to do this. And in Pennsylvania, there was a remarkable situation where one of the companies, and I forget which one, suggested they developed a way to use acid mine drainage coming out of coal mines as a frack water additive instead of using fresh water, but there was a state regulation for some reason saying you can't get economic advantage out of using a waste product or something, so they never actually did it. But the point is that the chemical engineers are at work to try to solve the issue so that maybe in the future we won't have to use fresh water, but bad water to do the actual fracking.
Thank you. And Mr. Lomax, my time has expired. I did want to ask a Coloradan a question, but my time has expired.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Oh, all right. So, you know what? I'm done. I'll let this group, or I'll talk to Mr. Lomax offline.
Congressman,
Okay.
I would like to, if I could, add a little context to the local and state issues about regulation in Colorado. I think what you've seen in Colorado is that, on the whole, in the majority of cases, you see the oil and gas industry working constructively with both state and local governments in order to, and even supporting local regulations in order to make sure that the development is done responsibly and is done with the support of the community. There have been, as you know, some cases where there have been local bans enacted, and there has been very sort of broad regulatory and bipartisan opposition to local bans. But in terms of local regulation, there is a lot of really sort of constructive work going on between the state, between the industry, and between local governments. Now, that kind of stuff doesn't generate a lot of headlines because there isn't a lot of conflict associated with it. But during this whole oil and gas task force that the governor set up last year, you had the Colorado Municipal League and you had the Colorado Association of Counties say, we can work through these issues using the existing regulatory framework rather than coming up with statewide policies that are basically being proposed by national ban fracking groups.
Thank you.
Mr. Holstein has been, he wanted to say something. So
thank you, because I just am going to crystallize an important point that Mr. Lomax is making here. We believe that the set of rules that the state of Colorado has put into effect in the last year are among the most progressive and comprehensive in the nation in terms of the range of issues they develop. And we were delighted to partner with the 3 largest oil and gas developers in the state in coming together to develop the consensus that led to that comprehensive new set of rules. But the driver for that conversation, what brought everyone to the table, was the fact that Colorado communities, one by one, were adopting or considering bans, putting them on the ballot, and there were indeed headlines across the state about whether or not oil and gas development, particularly involving unconventional development, including hydraulic fracturing, would be permitted in the state. So I'd simply point out that this is the danger of ignoring the local concerns that can sometimes lead to these bans. You need to bring people together, and you need to take aggressive action to address the issues.
Thank you, and I'm going to be drummed off of this committee if I take any more time.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I live in a very rich, shale-rich region of eastern and southeastern Ohio, and hydraulic fracturing has been a process that has had profound economic, positive economic implications to the people that live in Appalachia, Ohio. So I'm very concerned about some of the issues that we're talking about here today. And Chairman Craddock, there's been a lot of discussion about earthquakes here this morning. Is there some confusion that the earthquakes are being caused by hydraulic fracturing when it's really the deep well injection of the waste? Would you take a minute and comment on that?
First and foremost, thank you for the question, and I will say your governor and some of your legislators and regulators have been to the Railroad Commission so we can explain what we're doing. So hopefully we continue to give you good advice as you are putting a vibrant oil and gas community together up there as well. You know, we obviously all take seismicity very seriously, and the information available today is that hydraulic fracturing is not causing earthquakes. That's the information available in Texas today. We are still researching and looking at the available science, and we just had an SMU study come out on Monday night, Tuesday this week, that our seismologist is going through and working with them. We hope they present this study to us in the near future so we can ask our appropriate questions as both regulators. I know the legislature is in session right now in Texas. They want to ask questions as well. So we're still looking at deep water injection wells and whether that is the potential challenge in Texas. So the answer is, I don't think anybody absolutely knows. What I do think some of these studies potentially do is rule out potential problems that could be caused by earthquakes.
But let me clarify, just for the record. You're saying there's no evidence yet at this point that would indicate that hydraulic fracturing is causing earthquake.
That's the information we have available. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
And what I think some of these studies do is rule out issues, but I'm not sure they can ever tell you specifically what is specifically causing it, too.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Dr. Siegel, many advocacy groups have claimed that the methane found in drinking water of various homes was caused by hydraulic fracturing. Now, if methane is naturally occurring, how can you tell if it's naturally occurring or as a result of oil and gas development?
Well, I've always thought it was fairly simple. If you have fugitive gas from a gas well, my understanding, and if it gets out and gets into a domestic water supply, what you'll find is methane Alka-Seltzer being produced, where it was not there before. Now, there are some places in Pennsylvania and in New York where we have naturally methane Alka-Seltzer occasionally coming out of some drinking waters, wells, and where there's no drilling at all. And this is a unique geologic situation. But the state of Pennsylvania doesn't, to my knowledge, identify fugitive gas by analyzing and seeing dissolved concentrations that you can't see get higher. I mean, basically, homeowners say, my well is bubbling gas and it hasn't bubbled before, and there's a gas well nearby. So the very few cases that I know there have been fugitive gas, and most of which have been easily taken care of by re-cementing, it's very apparent. All right, and so that's what concerned me about those previous studies, that they're looking at dissolved methane, the stuff you can't see, and saying that increases in these, which vary enormously over time, naturally, are somehow related to oil and gas, and that's what we found wasn't the case.
Sure. One follow-on question. You know, although it makes for good cinema and anti-fracking advocacy, is natural gas in drinking water a new phenomenon?
Well, not to my knowledge. The very first time I came to Syracuse, 1981, the first call I got from a citizen who heard there was a hydrologist there had to do with natural gas in their water well. It was near Saratoga, New York, where I grew up. And, you know, I asked a few questions, and that particular natural gas came from a wetland setting. The U.S. Geological Survey in New York did a study on natural gas and found every well had some natural gas. At Syracuse, I'm funded by National Science Foundation to look at natural gas in the southern tier of New York, and pretty much every place we've looked for it, there's been natural gas, and certainly in Pennsylvania the same way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Siegel. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be respectful of my colleagues' time and our witnesses' time and yield back within my prescribed time.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byers, recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses, too, for being here with us today. Dr. Siegel, you expressed some concern about the Duke professor studies and the bias in their sample collection, the 146, two of them, or some of them near two of the wells that had failed. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you gathered your 12,000 or whatever you're working on, they were gathered by employees at Chesapeake, a natural gas exploring. Why is that inherent bias not much greater than independent researchers working for a university?
Well, I think you mischaracterized what happened with Chesapeake. Chesapeake Gas, to my knowledge, I mean, what I was told, is they hired national consultants who sampled for them in national recognized certified labs by EPA and so forth to do the analyses. So Chesapeake didn't sample themselves. They hired independent contractors who are hired all over the country in environmental work to do the sampling. And so I don't see that those samples could have been compromised or would have been compromised by the fact that Chesapeake hired independent consultants to do the sampling, much like, you know, I hire a laboratory to do analyses for me.
Doctor, you also expressed, some concern about I guess maybe blogs or others that were critical of the failure to disclose your connection to Chesapeake in the original peer review. I know you corrected it last week, but the original said the authors declare no competing financial interest, even though the samples were paid for to be collected by Chesapeake. You were funded by Chesapeake, and one of the co-authors was an employee at Chesapeake. Can you explain this oversight, now corrected?
Well, you know, I don't think it was an oversight in the sense that the editors and everyone else in the journal fully understood by the bylines under our names that it would be obvious that we were being paid by Chesapeake. Chesapeake or any of these large corporations is not going to just hand over 34,000 analyses and say just do with them what you want. It was a collaborative agreement. And so my colleagues across the country, when they started seeing these blogs about me, you know, they said, well, of course, you must have been paid by Chesapeake. But I guess it's an oversight in the context that people brought it up, and so we took care of it. And as editor, you know, as I said, I've edited, I don't know, 5, 6 journals in my career, and I've seen lots of cases like this. So, yeah, I mean, it's a corporate connection.
Okay, all right, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Lomax, you again expressed great concern about so-called advocacy science, and you know, there so much of this is one side not trusting the science of the other. Why is it advocacy science when citizens worry about what's happening in their community to their health, possibly? But it's not advocacy science when the oil and gas industry hires scientists and journalists and others to represent their perspective.
I'm sorry. So the question is,
well, what makes Mr. Holstein's science advocacy science and yours not?
well, let me start by saying that you know, the white paper that we released today on the New York fracking ban is primarily about a failure to disclose all the interests that are being brought to the table and the funding thereof. And so, you know, I think that as a representative of the oil and gas industry and as an advocate for the oil and gas industry, you know where I'm coming from. And what we found when we looked at some of these research papers, particularly the research paper that was both written and peer-reviewed by opponents of the industry, that opposition to the industry wasn't disclosed, so that people weren't able to judge for themselves whether that information was trustworthy or not. So it was an issue of disclosure rather than it's not a question of whether or not people can advocate for a political viewpoint that they believe in. Of course they can, but if they're going to try to represent themselves as then, you know, independent researchers when they're actually running campaigns to try to ban hydraulic fracturing in New York, that's something that at the very least needs to be disclosed. And you don't have to take my word for it. There are plenty of scientific codes of conduct that say these sorts of conflicts at the very least need to be disclosed.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Craddock, how does geology impact the process of fracking, the composition of the formations that you're fracking?
Obviously, that's one of the things we rely on operators to look at. But if there is a fault, and that fault is a known fault, then we make sure that we're not allowing drilling to occur in that fault first and foremost. We take that into account, as do companies. That's part of their risk assessment as well.
All right. In that regard, isn't it true that the geology of Texas, the history of it is that there's been more than 100 earthquakes large enough to be felt over the recent past? How many of those could, the ones in the 1800s, the early 1900s? I've got a whole list of Texas earthquakes that occurred before fracking. Why do you think that happened?
You've done your research, obviously. You know, we had a question earlier about Irving. When you look at the history of Irving, it actually is an earthquake capital of Texas. That really, we don't have really any oil and gas going on in it. So I think it's a fair suggestion to think there are other things besides just oil and gas causing earthquakes at this point.
How about Oklahoma? There's been a long history of earthquakes in Oklahoma. I know it may not be a fair question for you since you're not from Oklahoma, but isn't that true as well, that there have been a number over the last 100 years of earthquakes in Oklahoma that probably were not attributable to any human activity?
I believe, even though I'm not from Oklahoma, we obviously share a border, and we pay attention and work with their commission as well, and so that would be a fair statement. Yes, sir.
It's also true of Colorado, and it's a little more difficult because they've only, in terms of history, recently been tracking Colorado earthquakes. I think maybe the earliest was 1870, but they had a series of earthquakes that occurred in Colorado that caused damage in the early 1900s in Denver, and obviously there's more damage as there's more building and more settlement and more people moving in. You start to notice these things as there's more people. I'd also like to cite something from a report from the University of Texas Institute of Geophysics, the Jackson School of Geosciences. Talks about along the Gulf Coast, northeast Texas, the earthquakes with the magnitudes between M4 and M4.8. It says, fortunately, the vast majority of petroleum fields and injection wells do not cause earthquakes, and the majority of human-caused earthquakes are small and harmless. Would you agree with that?
That's what we've seen thus far, yes, sir.
Thank you. Also, in regard to methane emissions, since we're on the topic of the University of Texas, there was a research report done through the University of Texas that was done in close coordination with the Environmental Defense Fund. I think one of our witnesses works for them. And they've basically found that EPA's estimates for methane emissions are far lower than what anti-fracking groups frequently claim. As a matter of fact, I think as the newer technology has been employed, that they're capturing most of these emissions now. Could you validate that?
While we don't do air emissions, we do work with our sister agency, the TCEQ in Texas, and they are telling us and believe that air emissions for methane have dropped about 70% in Texas since 2001.
So could we possibly conclude from that as the technology has improved, the methane capture has improved along with it?
I believe that would be a fair conclusion, yes, sir.
Thank you. One last thing is, it was mentioned that that states ought to be able to regulate. Well, actually, it was Justice Brandeis was quoted, but I believe it was Justice Brandeis that referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. I agree with that statement, and I think that the states have, particularly since they have more knowledge of their geological issues than the federal government does in many respects, that these things should be dealt with at the state level. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to echo sentiments shared earlier by our ranking member. It's very odd to have a hearing in which we seem to be belittling local communities for their decision-making about their own quality of life. I think that kind of freedom is the essence of our democracy. To claim that communities are making these decisions simply because of bad information is rather interesting, but irrelevant. I could point out that bad information on climate change or on the costs of the Affordable Care Act, which some refer to as Obamacare, seem to be driving all kinds of voter choices around our country. But I don't think my friends on the other side of the aisle are going to work very hard to set those records straight. So, to my questions, first to Mr. Lomax. In your testimony, you state that research by Energy in Depth found that many of the research papers cited by the State of New York's health review of the process of hydraulic fracturing were financed by groups that oppose fracking. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also cite a specific study where the authors failed to mention that they have direct ties to opposition groups. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So it seems to me that the point you're trying to make is that we should not trust the results of these studies because the work is financed by groups opposed to fracking. That is a bit ironic given the fact that the Energy in Depth effort was founded by the Independent Petroleum Association of America, along with financial support from the American Petroleum Institute, the API, Chevron, Shell, BP, and other oil and gas companies. So by your logic, we should not trust Energy in Depth either. When Energy in Depth was launched by IPAA in June of 2009, they sent out a letter announcing its launch. The letter said, and I quote, energyindepth.org, a state-of-the-art online resource center to combat new environmental regulations, especially with regard to hydraulic fracturing, and I close quote. In a paper by one of your colleagues, Chris Tucker, published last year, he describes how Energy in Depth helps to combat opponents of hydraulic fracturing. And he wrote, and I quote, the EID teams also help generate and guide stories behind the scenes. This year alone, the number of news stories influenced was in the hundreds, and close quote. And he goes on to say that, quote, EID regularly engages on social networks such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, always with the goal of driving the debate, close quote. Mr. Lomax, appearing before a congressional committee isn't a very behind-the-scenes way to drive the debate, but I appreciate this opportunity to ask how you generate and guide stories behind the scenes. With a number of news stories influenced by EID in the hundreds, could you tell us how you carry out that influence?
Let me deal first with your question about the failure to disclose ties to the campaigns trying to ban fracking in New York by researchers who were producing papers cited by the state of New York in order to ban fracking. My criticism of that practice was the failure to disclose those ties so that this research was, and these researchers in effect misrepresented themselves as unbiased observers as opposed to advocates. I
only have so much time with my questioning here. Just to the question, how do you carry out your influence? I'd rather hear about that right now.
Well, I'm not sure about carrying out my influence. I can tell you that I am, as I said before, and I've been very clear about, I am an oil and gas industry advocate. I'm
right, but you're involved in several behind-the-scenes scenarios. So how do you carry out your influence? What publications tend to be the most receptive to story ideas pitched by your organization?
I see my role both here before the committee and answering questions from anyone who has questions about the way oil and gas is produced, is to direct them to authoritative sources like state regulatory agencies, like federal regulatory agencies, and members of academia who can help answer their questions. That basically is the role that I serve, and it is very much and I draw upon the skills that I had as a reporter trying to find answers for myself.
Let me also ask, though, does the press even know to contact you? EID isn't exactly a household name. Is this like orchestrated behind the scenes with an effort to obviously provide a bias? I mean, researchers who observe real occurrences are not biased to reality? Perhaps? What contacts do the press have? How do they know to reach the EID?
Well, they first of all could go to our website, energyindepth.org. My email address at energyindepth is simon@energyindepth.org. I don't think that there is much about Energy in Depth that is hidden or behind the scenes, as you suggest.
Well, I was only quoting from the individual who's in charge of carrying forth the mission.
Okay. I see my role, and it's one that I am very proud to hold as an advocate for the oil and gas industry, is to get facts in front of people who want to see them, and that's really as far as it goes.
Well, it's always, I'm reminded that it was the goal of driving the debate that the presentation was done.
As I think I had said in an earlier answer that the people that I am privileged to work with in the oil and gas industry, particularly geologists and engineers and other technical experts, they want a debate driven by facts. And someone has to put the facts, someone has to help disseminate the facts, and Energy in Depth, particularly through its website, makes those facts available.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses that are here today. It's interesting that we're talking about facts and science and true science. Just last week, I was subjected to an interview by a member of the media who asked me to make a statement regarding global warming or climate change. As a conservative, as an outdoorsman, I made a complete statement that I think we need to look at true science and the facts that we see the science, but at the same time, we shouldn't pollute our land. We should be good stewards of the environment. Unfortunately, the reporter decided to parse out my statement and take out all of the parts that did not support the end of which he wanted to make his article. And I'm afraid I'm seeing more and more of that, to where even in some of the scientific communities, where in the past scientific opinions were based on true science or fact, but today it seems that we're manipulating the facts to support whatever political end that we want to come up to. And so the question goes back to some research from a minority staff report on the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee from October last year. The New York-based Park Foundation asked Professor Howarth to write an academic article that would make a case that shale gas was a dangerous, polluting fuel. Later that year, the foundation paid $135,000 for that study. When the study came out, allegations mounted that there was data manipulation and unsubstantiated assumptions. In the end, it was almost universally condemned by the current administration and others in academia, and later by the Environmental Defense Fund. However, environmental activists such as Robert Kennedy Jr. and Bill McKibben of 350.org supported the work as proof that hydraulic fracturing was worse than coal. Dr. Siegel, how can this type of paper ever make it past the peer review process?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. I know Bob Howarth quite well. I've debated him, actually. And he's a very good estuarine ecologist, among other things. The problem really in the review process, and I speak as much as an editor as a contributor to publications, is that, let me just give you very quickly how it happens. A scientist submits a paper to a journal, and it goes to the chief editor. The chief editor then assigns an associate editor to handle the paper. The associate editor then has to find 3 to 5 reviewers, peer reviewers, who would be viewed to be non-biased and so forth, to review the paper. Usually the person writing the paper suggests 3 names, and the editor or the associate editor can assess whether those names would be okay, and then they pick some others from outside. It's not unlike NSF and how they do their work. Okay, the problem that's happened is that the publication system is so overwhelmed with submittals that a lot of editors simply will take whoever is offered as possible reviewers by the author in order to actually get the peer review. And that's what probably happened in the papers that we're referring to with respect to the health department ruling in New York. In my case, for example, the paper that I submitted just got published. I chose a professor at Penn State who was clearly unbiased, National Academy of Science person. I chose a couple of people from the United States Geological Survey who I thought knew a lot about methane and done independent work. And I purposely did not choose for my reviewers who I recommended, anyone who I thought would be biased, towards the oil and gas industry. And I know who those people are, okay? And so I got the review back, and there's some really good comments, and we modified the paper to address certain concerns, and out it went. But that kind of openness that I think I'm proud that I do on my review issues, it sometimes doesn't happen. And clearly there have been a lot of papers, number of papers that have been opposing hydraulic fracking. These papers have been really pretty outrageous. And when I asked the editors, well, who reviewed these papers to let them out, and I discovered that it's a community of people who have common views.
They have an end in mind.
Have an end in mind, and that's just unfortunate. But part of it is the system's clogged. I've written a couple essays on this, published in Science and Nature. On there's just too many papers being submitted, too few reviewers to do it capably. And so stuff is getting out that just really isn't very good.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Loudermilk. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to return to the issue of injection-induced seismicity. And just first, a general question. What fraction of hydrofracking operations depend on wastewater injection for their economic viability? So specifically, let's imagine that in some area it turns out that wastewater injection had to be restricted because of seismicity concerns. Is that a mortal blow to fracking operations or merely a nuisance? Anyone who wants to?
If I understood your question, over 90% of the wells being drilled now are unconventional oil and gas wells, and they frequently use large quantities of water, as noted in my testimony. There, because of concerns about earthquakes and because of concerns about other problems, impacts on taxpayers, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, where the publicly owned water treatment work simply couldn't handle some of the materials that were coming back in that were coming to those treatment works in wastewater. States have been racing to put in place new measures to protect the taxpayers and their water supplies. But yes, and so now in Pennsylvania they don't do injection wells at all, and the wastewater goes to the state of Ohio mainly, that still permits deep well injection. So it is a common practice.
Typically our alternative
yes.
is if it turns out that it's only the wastewater injection that's the big problem.
Industry is working on recycling, but you can't do the scale of hydraulic fracturing that the industry is employing now without these large volumes, as far as I know.
Now, in areas where there appears to have been an increase in seismic activity associated with drilling and injection operations, is there evidence of either insurance rates going up or property values going down? And if that does happen, what is the legal framework for homeowners, recovering for their losses?
I can give you some information about property values in Weld County, Colorado, which is the county that has more oil and gas wells in it than any other in Colorado. Has almost half of the state's 50,000. And property values in Weld County have been growing significantly at the same time as increased oil and gas development, and there are some wastewater disposal wells in Weld County, Colorado. So in Weld County there is an increase in values.
Relative comparably situated places without the drilling activities? I understand Colorado real estate is doing pretty well these days. So this is a side-by-side comparison or just an absolute statement? That
this is based on some commentary from the Weld County tax assessor, who was asked specifically about do you see any kind of impact on oil and gas? Do you see any impact on property values based on proximity to oil and gas operations, including wastewater disposal wells? And he has said that they don't see any difference between that and the rest of the county.
Okay. And it's my understanding there's at least anecdotal evidence that in Oklahoma that there's some unhappy local residents who might be there might be some effect there of lowering property values. Anyway, okay. Another thing has to do with the time scale for observing and diagnosing seismic activity as a result of drilling or wastewater injection. You can imagine different geological scenarios, one of which is that you start the wastewater injection and you have a very large number of small quakes, or that there's nothing happens and that you just simply get a stress buildup underground to the point where you get, after a long period of time, one giant or relatively large quake. And how would you actually correctly identify the causal link? It would be easy in the first case because you could start and stop the wastewater injection and watch the seismic activity start and stop. In the second one, it sounds tough because you're talking about something where where a large seismic event could be the result of long, decades of drilling. And how do you handle that from a liability point of view, and from even identifying the causal relationship there?
I think that's what we're all trying to figure out at this point. Because if you look, for instance, in the Permian Basin, we've obviously been drilling for a long time and don't really see a lot of earthquakes at this point out there. But if you look in the Barnett Shale, which is where the SMU study is from, we've been drilling actively since 2008, but the amount of drilling has declined because it's a natural gas play by quite a bit. So that's where both seismologists and scientists are trying to figure out, because I'm not sure you can ever completely find the answer to your question. That's the biggest challenge is your modeling. It depends on the modeling of the scientific study, as I've been advised, and the researchers looking at that, but there's not one best model at this point.
Okay. My question about the legal framework, if in the end it looks like some real damage to the seismic stability has been done by these operations, what is the legal framework? Do individual homeowners have to sue someone who may have gone out of business years ago, or what is the...
Could we have a brief answer to this question? We're going to try to finish before we have to leave for votes. And who do you, Mr. Foster, who are you directing the question to?
Anyone who feels capable of answering it.
Congressman, I'll say I don't know the legal framework, but I'd emphasize that this is exactly makes this conundrum exactly makes my point earlier, which is that the oil and gas industry is not static, and therefore regulatory oversight and scientific inquiry must keep up with the ever-changing elements and challenges associated with this heavy industry.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Foster. If the three remaining members who have questions can limit themselves to 3 minutes each, we can get you all in. We have an hour's worth of votes, so I'd like to spare the witnesses having to wait for us. So, Mr. Molinar, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Be real quick, Ms. Craddock, thank you for being here. I wanted to get your perspective. It sounds like in Texas you work very hard to work with the local communities, and there's a partnership that you've been able to work out in resolving concerns. The question about the federal government's role. I know in Michigan we've been doing fracking for many years, and our Department of Environmental Quality has done, I think, a very good job communicating with citizens about the technologies being used, and I don't see a big role for the federal government in this. What is your sense? I mean, you're on the ground floor working with this both on the state level but also working with local communities. Do you see a role for the federal government that would in some way address issues that are not being addressed currently at the state level?
We think we do it best at the state, quite frankly, Congressman. When you look at Texas, we've had a casing fracking rule in place for 50 years. EPA is just now proposing one. So they're way behind where the technology is. So we think it's better at state and working with local communities. Look, at the Railroad Commission, we don't deal with noise, pollution, traffic issues. Those are local issues. So that's where we encourage operators to really work with those local communities and be good citizens. So, but I'm not sure where EPA or other federal agencies, and we're blessed that we don't have a lot of federal lands like some of the other western states do. But most of us who have been active in oil and gas for a long time, the states already have rules in place, and it would add another layer of bureaucracy is the biggest concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey.
Chairwoman Craddock, it's good to see you. And I wanted to just ask you a question about just some of the recent activities that have happened in Texas. And I think that it's perfectly reasonable that we would want to be able to produce any of our fossil fuels and natural resources that we have for energy here, so we don't have to depend upon the Middle East right now, particularly with all the craziness that's going on over there. I think it's perfectly reasonable that we want to be able to produce our minerals. I also think that it's perfectly reasonable, whether you're a fisherman or if you're a hunter or if you just like gardening in your backyard, that you want to be able to have clean air and clean water. And that is where your agency and city councils and what have you, they take those things into consideration when trying to pass ordinances. Now, in 2009, your hometown of Midland had some issues with spacing. The city council there, which is a community that is pretty much completely dependent upon oil and gas for the most part, they wanted to be able to create an environment where the city could thrive and prosper for economic development reasons, for the enjoyment of property, and they ultimately passed ordinances. Now, the city of Denton did that too, and the legislature acted, and Denton is a much more progressive or liberal city than Midland is. Do you think that these cities are being treated fairly in regards to being able to outline rules for themselves and how they want their city to be able to function? Because it just seems like there's some unfairness there. It seems like what Denton was trying to do was the same thing that Midland was trying to do. They were trying to come up with a policy that was good for their particular city.
Yeah, I think the difference between what Midland has done, which I think most people consider reasonable setbacks, that they worked with local operators and communities to try to figure out what worked for their community. The difference is that in Denton, they have banned the use of anybody in Denton being able to develop their own private property. Whereas with a local ordinance, you still can, with horizontal drilling, develop those properties because you can have a reasonable setback. And look, I think we all agree that being 500 feet or whatever a community considers appropriate for a setback to protect health and safety is not unreasonable. But banning hydraulic fracturing in a community, the private property rights of those individuals, you've basically banned drilling, which historically, as you know, has been the purview of the state to regulate it. And so that's the debate right now going on in the Texas legislature, and we'll see where they get.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vesey. And the gentleman from Texas, another gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And Chairman Craddock, thank you for your leadership. Thank you, all you witnesses, for being here today. But thank you, Ms. Craddock, for your leadership with the Railroad Commission of Texas. Texas has provided about 50% of the jobs in this country over the last 6 years. And I think fracking has been a huge contributor to that in more ways than one. But I represent the 36th district in Texas, in southeast Texas. There was an incident in 2012 where an individual claimed that the water from their garden hose lit on fire. As it turned out, a Texas district court found that the individual had coordinated this stunt with an environmental activist to deceive. In this case, the garden hose was attached to the gas line. How does your commission respond to these types of claims when you hear about this?
If somebody complains that they believe that a well has and their water is on fire, right, we're going to go out there and inspect it first and foremost. Right. Get the facts. If there really is a problem, we are going to penalize and enforce, make sure, one, there's remediation for the problem, and two, then penalize or enforce the rules that we have available to us.
Okay, well, as far as the actual number of legitimate incidents are concerned, perhaps only a handful from what I can read out of studies. How do we put these risks into perspective with the enormous economic and societal benefits of hydraulic fracking technology?
Historically, we've drilled over 1 million wells in the state of Texas, and we take all of those seriously. We have over 400,000 that are active wells that we are regulating as we speak. And part of our real challenge is to make sure we're out inspecting and enforcing our rules, but to make sure we're also doing it on a reasonable basis, that there are good rules in place, people know the rules, but to also make sure there are facts involved. And I think we're a very fact-based agency. We have good rules, I believe.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know we have to go vote.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Let me thank all of our witnesses today. This has been an exceptionally good hearing, and I want to say to you all, it's a credit to you and a credit to the significance of the subject, that we had 20 members appear at this hearing. That's probably a new record any time, but it's certainly a new record for a 9 o'clock in the morning hearing. So, again, appreciate your presence. Hydraulic fracturing has occurred safely for decades and is largely responsible for an improved economy, expansion of energy options, and less reliance on Middle Eastern oil. Given its history and importance to our economy, attempts to regulate the process should be based on sound science and not science fiction. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and written questions from members. Again, I thank the members and the witnesses, and we stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.